doesn't cost anything to be nice to people. And I have found, throughout my entire life, if you're just nice to people, you probably have a better chance of getting the desired result than if you get all in their face and flustered about it.
Tricia Walker is a singer and songwriter whose songs are deeply rooted in the American South. A native of Mississippi, Tricia has had success as a songwriter in country and gospel music and has performed extensively with several notable Nashville entertainers. She's a founding member of the Bluebird Cafe's most celebrated foursome, the Women in the Round, and she's worked to establish a Grammy Museum in Cleveland, Mississippi, to honor a place near and dear to her heart, the Delta and the roots of rock and roll. And this location is the only other Grammy Museum outside of LA.
We're glad you joined us to hear these inspiring stories from older adults, people who have so much experience and words of wisdom to share, but are sometimes overlooked in society today. I'm Sally Hussey, the CEO of 50 Forward, a Nashville-based nonprofit. Our mission is to support, champion, and enhance the lives of those 50 and older.
And I'm Susan Sizemore, your guide through these beautiful conversations with those who are living life to the fullest and who know how to squeeze the day in their second chapter of life. Now, in my second chapter and encore career, I'm following my passion for sharing the stories of older adults with you and with the world. If you like what you hear, please rate and follow Squeeze the Day on your favorite podcast platform. Today's Squeeze the Day is brought to you by the All of Us Research Program from the National Institutes of Health. Learn how you can help change the future of health by participating in the program. Visit www.joinallofus.org to learn more. In this podcast, learn why Tricia Walker is committed to her roots and to elevating the stories and music of the Mississippi Delta. Hi, Tricia. Welcome to Squeeze the Day.
Hey, Susan, it's so good to be here.
I'm so excited to have you as a guest. We've obviously known each other for a long time, but I want to share a little of that history with people that are perhaps in our world and beyond who want to learn a little bit about the music industry and just a little bit about some interesting background that you've contributed. So what brought you to Nashville?
Oh, well, that's easy. I had been in Mississippi, born and raised, educated in Mississippi. And in the late 70s, I was playing bars and restaurants and playing cover tunes and, had started kind of toying around with writing songs. I've always loved to write. And I was living in Jackson, Mississippi, and I knew a few professional musicians, just a handful of them in Jackson. And I asked them, I said, how do you get in the music business? There wasn't a roadmap back then. And they said, well, you've either got to go to New York or Los Angeles or Nashville. And remember, my hometown was 1,600 people. So New York was way too big. Los Angeles was way too far away. And I figured I'd go to Nashville. I figured if it didn't work out, it was 500 miles from Nashville to my mother's front door. And I thought, if it doesn't work, I can probably get back home in a day. So I packed the truck. I was telling someone just the other day, the urge to go became stronger than the fear of not to fail. I had to go give it a shot. I was 27, didn't know anybody. I had a lead on an apartment that I sublet for a few years before I found my old farmhouse. And that's what took me to Nashville. It was closer to home. I knew I could get home quickly if I needed to.
So we met back when you and my husband were both performing with country music legend Connie Smith. She's a member of the Grand Ole Opry, and I think you played with her for about 6 years. Those were such fun times.
They were great. Anytime I see anything on social media about Connie, I always post best boss ever. That was such a great gig, and we had such a great band. I mean, those were 6 of my most wonderful years in Nashville, no doubt.
That's fabulous. I think I've seen you say best boss ever, but in doing some research, saw something related to Connie and being the best boss, where you almost missed a stage cue, or you did, and how she handled it, which I thought was brilliant. If you don't mind sharing a little bit about all that.
Not at all. And she is such a gracious person. Quick backstory about my audition. I was writing for a publishing company in Nashville, and one of the people on staff told me about an audition for a country music singer. And I didn't grow up listening to country music. Being from Mississippi, I grew up listening to soul and R&B. And But when I got to Nashville and I was writing, and someone told me about this audition, and the name struck a little bit of something in my memory. And I remember I had an album from 1972 from a Jesus festival in Dallas, and it had multiple artists on it, and there was a lady named Connie Smith. So I went and grabbed my album, listened to it, and I went to the audition the next day, and I said, "Hey, were you in Dallas in 1972 at a Jesus festival?" And she's like, "Well, yes, I was." And so that was my introduction to the audition, got the gig, and we were on the Opry one night. And of course, those were those years when all the great legends were still there, Minnie Pearl and Roy Acuff and Bill Monroe and Hank Snow. And Connie had said, now, if we were on Mr. Monroe's show, you got to be ready because he's quick and you just never know how he's going to introduce people. And so we were backstage. Backstage joins the platform where the Opry is, the main stage. And we were back there kind of hanging out, talking. I don't know who I was talking to. And all of a sudden, I heard Connie's song, and I wasn't on stage. And this was early in my gig, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be fired right here on the spot. And so I ran to the wings, and sure enough, she had already been introduced. The band was out there, and there's no simple way to sneak onto the stage of the Grand Ole Opry. So I kind of did what I could and got out there. And of course, she just roared about it. She just thought it was the funniest thing ever, and I thought I was going to be fired. But that is a definite memory for sure. One quick story, I remember the first night we played, and Connie had told me, she said, "Now, Mr. Acuff, he'll either like you or he won't." And so I got kind of nervous, and as I recall, I had on, I think, a pair of jeans and some kind of top, and I had my guitar rag in my back pocket that I would wipe the neck of my guitar with. And so we were playing, and I have a distinct memory. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Mr. Acuff kind of walking around behind us, and I kind of felt something, and I didn't know what was going on. And I got off stage, and I looked, and he had autographed my guitar rag.
Oh my gosh.
and Connie said, "Well, he likes you. He likes you."
So that to me was so apparent. I was talking a little bit with some folks when I mentioned that I was going to be interviewing you. I said, Tricia seemed to have a very special bond with Mr. Acuff, and I couldn't explain it except to me, it appeared that when you took the stage, you guys said, "Well, hello, there's Tricia Walker, and how you doing, Tricia?" And you'd have a mini little conversation in front of everybody on the radio show. and then it opened up, with Connie and the performance. But tell us a little bit about that, and also the fact that Mr. Acuff, I think, had come to some jam sessions maybe at your place.
He did. We did have a fun little relationship. I'm sure he used that mini conversation as a way to, just as part of the show, to prep introducing Connie coming out there. But it really was fun. And he did. I had an old farmhouse about a half an hour outside of Nashville. And for 20 years, a little bit over 20 years, some friends and I would host a picking and a barbecue for songwriters, and that in itself is a whole nother story we might get into. But on occasion, Mr. Acuff would come out. He'd sing Wabash Cannonball. But he loved black walnuts. And this old farm that I had a couple of big black walnut trees, and every year my neighbor and I would pick them up. They're a lot of trouble, but if you can ever get down into the meat of a black walnut. And so I would usually, pick some out and package them and send them to him, and he loved those. That's kind of old country stuff, and he liked that a lot.
Oh, so cool. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the experience, not only as a musician playing the Opry, but there's the Opry that the audience in the Opry House sees. So that is one thing, and it's very visual and so different than what people listening on the radio might hear. And then, of course, during the time that we were both, probably you were working with Connie and I was doing PR for TNN, the Nashville network, but also the Opry, is we took it to TV. So then people could kind of get a little snapshot of what happened throughout maybe the production of a 30-minute segment. But there's so many different things. And then there's the backstage experience. Just share a little bit about that, because it's very interesting.
Oh, it certainly is. And it was a magical time. And I'm sure for this generation, the musicians that work the Opry, it's a magical time for them too. But, back in my day, Mr. Roy Acuff's dressing room was the first one off of the stage. And it really was a gathering place. He was very revered, and he was the king of the Opry. And And you sort of had to go by and be blessed by Mr. Acuff, if you would. And so I did. I would sit in his dressing room. I remember sitting in there, and there was this incredible young fiddle player named Mark O'Connor who would sit there and just play for hours for Mr. Acuff. And, anybody that was going to the stage, would pop in and say hello to Mr. Acuff. And if they had time afterwards or in between shows, come around and play a tune or two. And just standing in the wings, I was going through some pictures the other day, standing in the wings with Minnie Pearl and just talking to her. I mean, what a beautiful soul, and just funny and a consummate professional. And then people like Mr. Monroe, groundbreaking musician. I mean, who knew? And I remember the first night we went on, again, my little hometown was 1,600 people, and I remember standing behind the big red velvet curtains as they went up going, oh my gosh, I'm on the Grand Ole Opry. This is crazy. And so that backstage, and it really is a family, and I think it continues to be that, not only the artists, but particularly the staff band. The staff band, the musicians come and go a little bit, but when we were there working in that arena, that staff band and those staff vocalists had been there for years and years, and just kind of those behind the scenes professionals, some of the greatest musicians in the world. And just to see them work every weekend, these 15 and 30-minute shows, just like clockwork, it was such an education for somebody like me.
And so as a performer with Connie Smith, for example, when you got to the Opry, you would check in backstage, go to a dressing room, correct? And then you went on the stage and played for how long?
Correct. We had a dressing room. At that time, I don't know that Connie had a permanent one, but whoever was assigned to be on the show that night, they would assign dressing rooms for them, and we'd go in, check in, go in, and maybe run through a tune. We were typically on either 15-minute segments or 30-minute segments, so usually it only meant 2 songs, maybe 3. Connie was such a favorite of Mr. Acuff. He called her, and she still is known as the sweetheart of the Grand Ole Opry. Sometimes he would let her squeeze a 3rd song on there, but it wasn't many. And so you'd do one show in the early part of the evening, then they'd turn the house, and if you were fortunate enough to be booked on the second show, the late show, you'd do another set of 2 or 3 songs.
Yeah, so for the audience, you're seeing a lot of transition. Bands come in, they plug in, they play their song, they unplug, they run off, and then another band and artist show up. It's such an interesting kind of turnstile, if you will, and such a variety of artists. Tell us a little bit about some of the people that you've performed with.
Well, I've had the great fortune, the great blessing to perform with so many wonderful musicians and singers. My first road gig was with a gospel singer named Russ Taff, who used to be in a band called the Imperials. And then in the early 80s, mid 80s, he went out on his own and had a solo career. Fantastic voice. Oh my gosh. So I was able to land a background singer gig with him for a little while. So that was my first taste of being on the road. And it wasn't long after that the audition for Connie came up. And so, again, like you say, I was able to be part of her band for about 6 years. And during that time, these things kind of overlap a little bit. I met a musician named Bill Sinclair, who was a harmonica player and a sax player. And we began to play a little bit just, at the house and trying to figure out places we could play. That became a trio called the Mudcats, which I had for about 10 years. And that expanded into sometimes we called it the utility band, sometimes we called it the Highway 61 band, and that was basically Connie's band. Your husband, Mike, was my guitar player. It's awesome. And I was writing during this time, but I also, after I finished the gig with Connie, Paul Overstreet, another Mississippian, he was putting together a band, and I played guitar and some keyboard and sang for him for about 3 or 4 years, got to travel overseas couple of times with him. And then I did about a year in the very, very early stages of Shania Twain's career. I was a keyboard player and vocalist for her for about a year back in the early 90s when she was just coming on the scene. I was really fortunate to be on the road with some great people and then great musicians in the band.
Let's talk a little bit about songwriting success. Faith Hill, Patti Loveless, and Alison Krauss are among some of the artists that have recorded your song, and then Alison won a Grammy for one of your songs. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Like I say, I started writing probably what began to look like a song maybe in junior high, high school. Again, there was no roadmap. It just, and I was fortunate, to be coming of age during the time of the great singer-songwriters, Carole King, James Taylor, Jim Croce, all those people. And I was like, oh man, how do they do that? How do they tell a story like that? So I became intrigued by that. And that was probably my internal launch for songwriting. So when I came to Nashville, I had a briefcase full of cassettes. The only real information I could find about songwriting back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a publication out of Los Angeles called Songwriter magazine. It's the only one I'd ever seen. And so I subscribed, and it had articles in it as to how to record a demo tape, how to make an appointment with a publisher. And I still have those magazines. It's so funny. The technology in them is hilarious now. So before I moved, I would make a couple of trips to Nashville and made appointments, found people's names and numbers. You have to be kind of a detective and set up an appointment and, got some good feedback. The one thing I will always say about Nashville, and I hope it does not change, I'm a little fearful right now. For all the no's that you got, at least from my experience, publishers and people who listened to my material were never unkind in their criticism. They were straight up. They'd tell you that it wasn't ready yet or it wasn't that great of a song. I remember my first appointment with over at Acuff Rose Publishing, and the publisher I sat for, he listened very patiently to my little greenhorn songs, my little early career songs, and he nodded and he said, well, that's not bad, but it's got to be as good as or better than this. And he took a Barbara Mandrell 45 single with a song by a writer that I became friends with named Tom Schuyler. And at the time, I think it was number one at the time, it was called Years After You. And he just put the record on it. He said, well, if you're going to do this, it's got to be as good as or better than this. And I'm like, thank you very much, sir. I understand. Thank you very much. And I thought that was a kind way to do that. And so again, I had made a little 4-track demo in the late 70s, a huge paradigm shift in technology with the advent of the Tascam Portastudio, which meant that you could record more than one track at a time. And for songwriters, this was awesome, and of course it was expensive. I was poor as a church mouse. So, saved up, spent it, bought this piece of equipment where you could record your guitar and your voice, and then you could record a harmony part, and then you could record something else. So I made a 4-track tape, which began to open my doors in Nashville. I played it for a friend of mine that I'd been in church with. She was the receptionist of a new publishing company called Word Music in Nashville. She played it for somebody in the back room, and they heard something they liked and offered me a couple of single song contracts. So that was the way I got my foot in the door.
Very, very cool. And it's nice to hear that they played such a well-known and respected single by Barbara Mandrell. What a polite example. And I'm sure it just, gave you a bar to try to reach.
Not a bad thing at all.
So I want to talk a little bit about something you've done recently. I know that you've worked with some folks back in Mississippi to establish a Grammy Museum in Mississippi, and it's second only to the Grammy Museum outside of Los Angeles. That's such a huge accomplishment. Why is it so important to you not only to set that milestone, but to also preserve the songs, music, and heritage of the Delta?
Let me first of all say, I was just part of the circle of people who really had the vision for something like this, right place, right time. And the staff at the time at LA and the director there in LA at the time was a musicologist and an educator, and he understood the importance of the music that has come from Mississippi and more particularly the Delta, particularly the blues, which can be argued as the root of all great American music, and that's really right here in the Mississippi Delta. And it has made an enormous difference. The little town where I live now, Cleveland, Mississippi, is about 12,000 people. And so it is a huge thing for our town. It has made an enormous difference in economics and tourism and cultural development and historical preservation. And music is the one thing that connects us all, across all kinds of lines and arguments. Music, who doesn't like music? And it's one of the greatest exports, particularly that Mississippi has ever had. We're not the industrial capital like the Northeast and that sort of thing. But what we have here and have always had is great music, great art, great storytellers, just things that I hope will never go away. Some people may look at us and think it's a little bit slow or we're behind the times, and that may be true on some regards, but there are some things here that are just precious and we don't want to lose. And so to be a part of that, encapsulating all that in the Grammy Museum, Mississippi here has been really, really an honor. I was on the founding board of directors and have now kind of fill more of a volunteer role, do some programming. And it's just amazing to see how it affects the lives of children and young people here in the Delta and all over Mississippi and all over the Mid-South.
What an accomplishment. And I do feel like, thinking about your roots, what a perfect place for you to be and a perfect time for you to be part of that initiative. So I want you to talk a little bit about Heart of Dixie.
Happy to. For all the songwriters out there, sometimes you just have to wait on a song. That song, which is really, I consider really the cornerstone of the heart of what I write, I wanted to write a song about the African-American woman that helped take care of me as a child. That was a very common thing for this part of the country, and particularly in my generation. There typically was an African-American woman who would help with the home and with the children. And so this person was in my life, and when she passed away in the early 80s, I was in Nashville. I wasn't able to come home to the funeral, but I wanted to write something for her. But I found, as I'm going to guess other songwriters might agree, it's hardest to write the songs about people that are closest to you. That's tough. You can't step away as much as you would like to. So I began to write it. I went back and forth into my writing notebook over a period of 9 years. 9 years. And I say sometimes that songwriting is like having children, and somewhere in the middle of the night, the labor pains started. And so I got up, got the pencil, began to write it, and this time it felt like it was going in the right direction. And I wrote it and finished it in a way that was just a gift handed down from heaven, just given to me. And so I finished it and I put it away. I was pleased that I had finished it. I felt satisfied. Didn't really play it much, and then one night I played it at the Bluebird, and it got a very emotional response from most of the people in the room, particularly grown men. And I thought, I've struck a nerve here. What's going on? And realized that it was a central part of my story and a lot of the stories of the Southerners, who had that same experience. And so I did an album with that song as the centerpiece of it. It's still, if I had to pick one, that's probably the most special song I would say in my own catalog.
It's got a message that really kind of digs deep into history and to life. You were one of the founding members of a group that was super popular, and I'll never forget how many times I wanted to come see you in that prestigious Bluebird Cafe that now everyone who has seen the Nashville series and who comes to Nashville wants to go see the Bluebird. But you were back there in the early days when it was really a songwriter's haven, and it was hard as heck to get a ticket to come see you and the women in the round. So let's talk a bit about those days and the name of the group, et cetera.
Yeah, we were something for a while now, weren't we?
You were, you still are, but you had a following that was just, I think at some point, maybe I tried to pull in a favor or two to get, not on a list. I didn't want a free ticket, I'd pay, but it was hard to just get in the door and get a table.
It certainly was. It certainly was. Those were special years too. The story I heard was, the Bluebird has a stage, but the four guys, I don't know if they'd been at the bar and they just couldn't get to the stage, so they stopped in the middle of the room and sat in a circle in the middle of the room and started playing songs. Well, that's the story I got as to how it started. So about a year later, I'd been in town at that point for about 7 or 8 years. I had met Karen Staley through some songwriting events, and then Ashley Cleveland was friends with Pam Tillis, and so we were like, why don't we try this? Let's try this. And so the four of us got together. We got together one time. Everybody brought a song list, and we got together one time and rehearsed, and that was in 1988. And we did our first show, at the Bluebird in the middle of the room. And we just called ourselves the women in the round because the guys were the, writers in the round or something, or in the round. It was just a new term. Nobody knew what in the round meant. And so we were just the women in the round. We've done it as women in a straight line, women in a triangle. We've done it very, very, but women in the round is the thing. And so, off and on. And those were some great nights. Oh my gosh. Back in the day, people couldn't get in. They would sit on the phone lines and, talk about a magical time and talk about what really makes Nashville great are those nights at the Bluebird. Certainly probably the high point of my time in Nashville were those nights with the women in the round at the Bluebird. There was nothing else like it.
If this conversation is motivating you to squeeze the day, learn more about getting involved in your home community, to deliver food, to volunteer, or to just get active. If you'd like to learn more, visit 54.org. That's FIFTYFORWARD.org. There's so much to gain by helping others. Now, let's get back to our show. Don't you find it interesting when you start realizing that, there's room for that next generation to step in and it's time to step aside?
Oh, yes. It's a lovely thing because the fact of the matter is you get tired. Oh, my gosh. I consider myself, I've got a pretty good bit of stamina, but I'm like, you know what? I'm going to pull the old woman card here and let this young person do that. So let's do that. I like that idea. So, yes, but it's a great blessing. Again, after I retired, this community here has been so supportive of me the day I came back. And when I retired from Delta State with the Grammy Museum here, we've really been trying to focus on tourism development in identifying Cleveland as a roots music town. And it is an intentional play on words because we are an agricultural area, part of the state. And just trying to help promote and develop semi-pro musicians. The musicians here that I work with now, they're not going to leave and go to Nashville. They've got homes and families here, but they still enjoy music and they enrich our community with what they do. And so we put a roots umbrella over it. We call it Deep Roots, deltadeeproots.com. And I'm having fun doing that. I always enjoyed teaching and just sharing information, so I'm having a good time doing that.
Very cool, and it seems like it's so appropriate for you and the Tricia that we even, got to know years ago. Tell me about this Yaya group of women, because there seems to be kind of a cord of sisterhood throughout your life with the women in the round and now the Yaya sisters.
Well, Yaya's, came from the book title, the Yaya Sisterhood. But these are my two best friends that I grew up with. Our mothers were friends. Our grandmothers were friends. So we are third generation best friends. We went all the way through school together. They're just those two close friends, three musketeers that we've seen each other through a lot of life. We're all three grateful that we've made it this far. We're at the point now when we get together, we talk about what medications are we taking and, what hurts the most. but we get together a couple of times a year and take trips. And they're just they're the anchor. They're my anchor. They're my heart. They know me probably better than anybody. And I just love them to death. They'll remain anonymous because they'd be embarrassed if I told you their names, but they are the Yayas.
That's so cool to think that it goes back that many generations, those relationships from your grandparents forward. Mm-hmm. So now let's do a speed round of questions. As a songwriter, what do you consider your greatest success?
Well, on a monetary level, it would probably be the Faith Hill cut because I got to renovate my kitchen out at the farm when I did that. But, on a deeper level, it's the satisfaction of finishing a song like Heart of Dixie. It's the satisfaction of having a place in a round with people like Pam Tillis and Ashley Cleveland, Karen Staley. Those are the successes.
Mm-hmm. Where did you first learn to sing?
I had an incredible music teacher named Miss Iska Montgomery who taught me piano lessons from the time I was 6, and she was our public school music teacher. And outside of my parents, she's probably the greatest influence on my life. So I learned to sing and learned to play piano and learned music from her all the way through high school.
And then piano must have translated to another instrument, because I don't associate you with piano.
Well, that's true. I was actually a music major here at Delta State with an emphasis on piano. So I'm classically trained in piano. But after I saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, I'm like, oh, I want to do that. And so my mom and daddy bought me an inexpensive K guitar from the Western Auto store in Fayette. And you really had to want to play those chords with your fingers bleeding. And so again, I taught myself guitar, but I had such a strong theory background that, it was able to translate.
Very interesting. What would you tell your younger self?
Follow your heart, and if I was going to tell my younger self about the music business, which I told a lot of students here, it is incredibly hard, and it will break your heart, and it will also bring you great joy. You better be having a thick skin if you're going to pursue this as a profession. Now, you can do it as a hobby, but, follow your heart. I'm one of the fortunate few in the world probably that have been able to make a living doing the very thing I love, and I don't know a lot of people that can say that. So follow your heart.
Is performing or songwriting your true love?
Both in different ways. There's great satisfaction of feeling like you've completed the song in the way it should be written. But I really enjoy singing, and I think even the older I get now, I probably enjoy singing more.
There are a couple questions that we ask all of our guests, and one of them relates to maybe some advice that you got from a parent or an older adult that might have shared with you that at the time you thought, this is really silly, but now that phrase rings true in your everyday life.
A couple of things. I remember, when I was going through probably the angst of middle age, 35, 40, and my mother thankfully was still living. And she would always say, just be happy. Just be happy. And I used to push back, and I'm like, you can't just be happy. There's stuff going on in life. Come on. And yet the older I get, I realize, yeah, you can. You just have to, you have to choose it. You have to choose it. You have to, embrace the joy. Even if it's surrounded by pain and heartache and all that, there is still an opportunity to choose joy and choose happiness. And the older I get now, the more I realize that's true. One of the other things she would say would be, it doesn't cost anything to be nice to people. And I have found, throughout my entire life, if you're just nice to people, you probably have a better chance of getting the desired result than if you get all in their face and flustered about it. So, the other thing would be just, try to do it right the first time so you don't have to redo it.
And then, Tricia, what is it that you do to squeeze the day?
Ooh, I squeeze the day. Well, trying to practice that attitude of gratitude, thankful that I can get up out of the bed and walk, even though things creak and pop. That's okay. I can still walk. Just to try to find gratitude for the little things, the fact that I can still see, the fact that even in an ice storm I have some food in my refrigerator, just the little things. I try to squeeze the day by looking out for the little things to be grateful for. It's really in the details. It really is. Life is in the details.
Really, really good advice. And I do think that, in so many ways, joy and putting priorities in place, when you look at the way things could be, we are all so very blessed.
Indeed we are.
So I want to thank you, Tricia, for taking time out of your very icy day and busy schedule to join us.
Oh, it has been my pleasure. What a treat.
Now, as I leave you today, I'm sending everyone, and you specifically, Tricia, a big hug. Until next time. Squeeze the Day is made possible through listeners like you. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us continue to share inspiring stories of older adults and visit 54.org. That's FIFTYFORWARD.org to make a contribution. And now I challenge everyone listening to go squeeze the day.